Ken Blake will be up next. I'll pass it over to him in just a sec. But after that, we will follow up with an announcement section. We have a couple of job opportunities I want to let you know about. I'll say more at the time. So at this point, Ken, I'm going to hand it over to you, and go ahead.
All right. So, Joe, you made the comment earlier that the title was kind of long, which I originally had as effective analytic activation. So I'm happy to announce I've taken one letter off this, and it is now holistic analytic activation. So we're driving efficiency with every step of this presentation. So happy to be here today. Thanks everyone for joining late in a Friday afternoon. Like Joe said, I'm the head of analytics for AMP Agency. I'm relatively new to the organization. In the past, I've led analytics organizations both on the agency side as well as with Staples on the corporate side. So what I'm going to talk about today is this concept of holistic analytic activation. I'll talk about how I'm defining that, why it's important, and how to achieve it, and some of the challenges with achieving it, some of the obstacles that you may run into. So I'll preface this by saying, I know we have a pretty broad group on the call. I'm assuming most of you are in some type of an analytics role, but based on my participation in some other discussions with this forum, there's probably a few of you that may not be specifically within an analytics role, but I assume you were at least supported by an analytics practice in some way, whether within your organization or maybe with a partner agency like FocusKPI. So some of what I'm going to talk about is about how to structure an analytics team in an appropriate way, the different skill sets that we need. For those of you who are not in analytics, I still think this will be relevant to you in that you're supported by these teams. So if you're having challenges with getting what you need from your analytic partners, hopefully some of the content here can help you drive some of those conversations with analytic leaders that support you to make sure that you get what you need in the long term. So hopefully there's a little bit of something for everybody, and I look forward to walking through with this video. There'll be a couple checkpoints where I'll ask for some feedback or thoughts. But if anything comes up in the meantime, in the chat screen, Joe, please let me know, and I'll be happy to answer that. So we'll talk about holistic analytic activation first. What is it? What does it look like when it's done well? And maybe just as importantly, what does it look like when it's done poorly? In order to achieve holistic analytic activation, what are the key requirements? Talk about team structure. We'll talk about the critical relationship between analytics and the business that analytics is supporting and what that engagement process looks like. And then we'll talk a little bit about skill sets, and I want to touch on what I'm calling the marketing scientist role, which I'll describe what that means when we get to it. And then we'll finish off by talking through some common pitfalls and how to avoid them. All right, so in its basic form, if you think about the initiative process and the different phases of an initiative process, we've got discovery, strategy development, implementation, and measurement. And those are very general terms, but in general, any type of initiative is going to encompass some form of this. So when I say holistic analytic activation, how I'm defining that is data analysis and tools are driving decisions within each phase of these initiatives, and also across all initiatives, right? Particularly key initiatives. So why that's important, you see the interlinkage between the four phases here. They're all self-reliant. They're all reliant on each other. None of them are self-reliant. So if you fail in one, you're going to impact the others. So if you don't do proper discovery, you're not going to develop a proper strategy. You may fall down on the implementation side because you haven't considered the operational components. And from a measurement standpoint, you may be measuring something that's not even a core business objective. So the need for discovery to go well and for analytic involvement, I think, is an obvious one. If you inform a strategy poorly, it's not informed by data and analytics, very difficult to salvage that through good implementation. If it's a bad strategy up front, no matter how well you implement, it's not going to turn out well in the long run. And even if you have strong discovery and strong strategy, if you implement it poorly, you can't offset weak implementation with a strong strategy. And then measurement, which all of us are very familiar with, if that's not done well, that really limits the ability to improve even a well-informed strategy. So why is it difficult to achieve this? And I want to get your thoughts on this as we move forward. But the four areas that I see the most often is either a lack of discipline, and that could be within our analytic teams, or it could be across the organization where we're rushing to get things done. So we try to figure out which steps to skip, and good analysis tends to be a step that gets skipped pretty often, particularly early in the process of planning an initiative. It might be misaligned skill sets. So you might have the right functional skills within the analytics team, but they might not have the right, what I call emotional intelligence, which I'll touch on later, in order to truly engage with the rest of the organization properly. The engagement process between analytics and the business may be broken. It may just be unstructured. It may be incomplete. And then sporadic business immersion, which I'll touch on later, that's the whole idea of, for an analyst to do a good job, he or she really needs to understand the business. It's not enough to be mechanically and technically strong and have the ability to build a robust model. If you don't understand the ins and outs of the business, very difficult for an analyst to reach his or her potential in terms of their contribution to the project.
Hey, Ken, can I pause here for a moment for you?
Of course.
I want to bring up the similarities and the importance of what you're saying in terms of business development, because I know that we have, a lot of small businesses here too. And so, if you look at why it's difficult to achieve, lack of discipline and misaligned skill sets, and you think about that in terms of opportunity for your clients, this becomes a lot clearer on how this relates back to an analytics function or an analytics consulting company trying to do business development for its clients. How do we give value to our clients? We have to know these areas of our clients. We need to build a relationship so we understand, what their business is like. And these are going to be the problems that they have, and that's why they don't have a good analytics department. So just kind of tying it back to a broader perspective as well. So thank you, Ken.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I always tell my teams is, we will never be as educated about our client's business as the client will be. And if we are, that's probably a sign that the client has some issues they got to work through. But we need to get as close to as possible to that. We need to see ourselves as an extension of their team, whether it's the marketing team or the sales organization or the product organization. It doesn't really matter. It depends on who we're supporting. But the closest we can come to being an extension of the team, the better off we'll be, regardless of whether you're within an organization or with a smaller practice or with a larger agency. All right, so I touched on this before. So discovery, strategy, implementation, measurement. Let's think of that as a standard life cycle. Before we dig into some of the specifics around how analysts can support each area, at least my thoughts on some of the challenges that organizations have in supporting each stage of the cycle, let's throw out some ideas, maybe one or two for each of these around how do you all think that data analysis can help the business at each stage of this continuum of this life cycle? Maybe we start with discovery. What can be done up front in discovery from an analytics standpoint to make sure that's a complete process?
Ken, I'll throw one out here. I'll get the ball rolling. Because I know that a lot of times the not understanding what the root cause of your problems are is a really big issue. So you might know you have problems, but you don't know exactly what's going on, what causes it, what are the variables that contribute to that. So in this instance, I would say an exploratory data analysis and just looking at the database. And I remember when you and I worked together, like that was a big component. We always wanted to go there. We wanted to go into that area where we had a team that was able to dig into the data and find anomalies, to really bring those issues to light. So that I would put that down for discovery.
Yeah, so it's almost the key there is making sure we're starting off in a good spot. It's in some ways you're better off making mistakes at the end of this continuum than early, because if you make a mistake early or there's some gap in that, the example you gave, we're defining the business challenge incorrectly, nothing else is going to matter if we miss on that one, right? So I completely agree with that. If we assess our analytics organizations or what we're doing day to day, and this goes for whether you're an analytics leader or you're a brand new analyst in the world, or if you are a function that is supported by analytics. What I see most often, and these are in order from left to right, partly because that's the order they tend to be executed, but it also tends to be inversely related to when analytics is typically brought in. And the challenge I see most often is analytics is seen as the people that measure the strategy that I implemented, right? So they may not be brought in, we may not be brought in early in the process, and then strategy's been developed, they start executing campaigns or some overarching initiative, and then they realize, all right, we don't know exactly how we're gonna measure this. Let's bring in the analytics people and they can help us with that. Well, the problem is, yeah, it's useful for analytics to be involved at that point, but we haven't gotten involved earlier in the process. So we're really just measuring something that may not have been informed by data and insight. So for those of you who are not Seinfeld fans, you may not love these next few slides, but you're just gonna have to deal with it because it's probably still my favorite show of all time. So we're gonna have the Seinfeld cast help us figure out whether these approaches are good. So in this scenario, analytics is primarily focused on measurements. Let's see what George thinks. Nope. So George thinks this is the Lord of the Idiots approach to analytics and developing a strong strategy, because we've missed out on discovery, strategy development, and implementation. So getting a little better is, okay, now you have scenarios, and I think, Joe, you and I have worked together long enough, we've seen this a lot too, where some discovery was done, we didn't necessarily have visibility into it, a strategy was developed, we didn't necessarily have visibility into it, and then once implementation came in, there was a realization that we need either a testing plan or we need some predictive modeling, maybe we need some kind of a segmentation scheme, all good stuff and all important to the process, but again, it's coming in a little bit late to the game. So, Elaine's gonna say, nope, that's not good either. We've got to go to another approach. Getting a little better is now strategy development. So now analytics is brought in for developing hypotheses, for determining target audiences, for figuring out what kind of promotions or offers are gonna be most effective, maybe defining content based on a segmentation. So we're getting a little better here. So Jerry's, not super thrilled with this, but he doesn't think it's a terrible idea. Then we've got the full picture, right? So discovery up front, and Joe, you touched on some of these earlier. You talked about the business objectives, and that's going to lead into some learning objectives. That's going to lead into an assessment of what insights currently exist and what gaps currently exist. What other kind of data mining do we need to do to fill some of those gaps, whether it's with analysis of very detailed transactional customer data or customer engagement data. It might involve some customer research. It might involve some broader market research. But the whole idea behind this is before we get to strategy development, we've learned everything we can possibly learn at that phase. So while the strategy may not end up perfect, we at least know that that's informed by all the work that we did up front. So we'll see if Kramer approves, and yes, he does. Giddy up. All right, so that's how I at least view the life cycle, and like these are pretty basic phases, and I don't think anyone would look at this and say, oh yeah, of course I would include analytics at each stage. But we all know in practice, that's not necessarily how it happens. And I'll just throw out a couple obstacles that I've seen, but welcome to hear from everybody else as well. One of the biggest obstacles that I see with getting analytics involved early in the process as well as throughout the process is that everyone's in a hurry to get things done. Right, so whether you're an agency or an analytics service provider or within an organization, no one's looking for the slow way to do things, right? They've got revenue goals, they've got margin goals, and they want to get something out the door, and whether it's a campaign or some broader strategy. And there's not always a lot of awareness as to what it takes to do that properly. And I think we have to look at ourselves sometimes as analysts and say, and ask the question, are we outspoken enough to make that clear? That in order for us to add value, we not only need to be involved early, but there needs to be a sensible timeline associated with that so that we're truly informing the process and not just coming in to measure at the end and sort of save the day with some type of optimization strategy. you get us involved earlier, it's actually much quicker, right? And I'll touch on that, a little bit of that later, but that's one of the big obstacles that I look at, I see is lack of understanding as to how long it takes to truly inform a good strategy, and a lack of patience to wait for that to play out or to manifest itself. Any other thoughts on that, or what you guys have seen or ways you've overcome it?
And this is great. Gary Tao here. Joseph, hi. I think this is a great topic. Ken has described the challenges we see because we sometimes get involved in the later stage. There are multiple reasons, as you said. One is that everybody's busy. The company culture is one thing, and also the personality of analysts is another. Yeah. Because if we have the self-reflection first, the analysts are generally problem solvers. They are not necessarily the best communicator or relationship builder, or let's say even a strategist. So some analysts even label themselves as developers. But whenever I hear that, I say, no, you are not a developer. You're not a programmer. You are not an analyst. You are a consultant, meaning you solve problems. And you happen to use this methodology or technique to solve the problem. And you have to communicate, you have to sell yourself, sell your capability all the time to other people. So I agree with Ken that you said, oh, we have to be vocal, we have to tell people, we have to really be brave and say, okay, wait a minute, why don't you give me the entire flow of the question, the context, and don't just call me at the last step, right? So this is how we behave and reflect on ourselves. The other part is that we also have challenges in terms of getting the seat on the table in the upfront stage for discovery, because when the strategy was formulated, we were not even at the table. That's why improving the visibility and exposure of data analytics to a more established function is very critical. So that way you are at the table. You are not necessarily become an afterthought to say, oh yeah, why didn't we think about that? So that's another. The third one is also the organizational cultural kind of like a structure. If data analytics is part of, let's say, IT, or part of finance, or part of sales, or part of marketing, then you are still being perceived as a technical department or working group. You are not being perceived as, okay, you are here trying to help us shift the entire organization's culture in terms of thinking of data as a strategic asset and resource to help us make better decisions with higher confidence, with higher accuracy, and basically become forward-looking instead of being reactive. So those things are coming together. And so to be an effective data scientist or analyst, or in this data analytics profession, we have to think about the big picture. So that's why technical skills is a must-have, kind of like table stake. You have to have that. But having that is not enough. You have to really go above and beyond.
Those are incredibly good points. And I think, Joe, you probably invited the wrong guy to give this presentation, because I think that description nailed it exactly. Now, some of that stuff I'm going to touch on going forward. I think the other great point brought up there is the overall structure of the organization, which I don't touch on here, but that can be a hurdle as well. That if you're embedded within marketing, very difficult to come up with an objective, what's viewed as an objective view of what's going on in the business. Joe, you and I have seen that in a past life, in that you're seeing, yes, maybe it's tactical, but also as perhaps biased, right? In that you're sitting within one part of the organization, but measuring effectiveness and providing insight to other parts of the organization, and it may not come off as unbiased as analytics actually is. Those are great points. Thanks, Gary, for bringing those up. And that segues well into what we're going to get into in a couple slides, and actually touches on it here. So just a few minutes. I know we're
hey, wait,
the original plan.
Hey, Ken, I thought I heard one more question just before
you
were on this.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for Gary's comments, and hi, Joseph. I just want to add some comments for the last questions, because I used to be a business development associate in a small company, a startup. And also at that time, I also was doing some data analytics work. And I find that after I doing some data analytics for my clients' profile analysis, sometimes I find our clients maybe not a potential clients for us to keep moving forward with them. But when the decision maker, the group leader of our department said we have to continue to do this, because sometimes we don't have a clear decision to be made by us after our data analytics. And some people, like some unstable elements cannot be used in our data modeling. But in the end, some customers or the clients could be a potential clients for us. So that's maybe sometimes a obstacle for our data analysis work.
Yeah, that's another great point, another good segue to some of the discussion that we'll have around the two-way relationship between analytics and the rest of the business, because that can be a big impediment. And I always struggle with how much of that is our problem to solve as an analytics organization, and how much of that is the rest of the organization's problem to solve as partners. And I think the reality is it's both. And it's just a matter of how do we get the right leadership together and the right processes together to make sure we're all pointed to the same end goal. Because when you have those conversations, there's rarely disagreement as to what the end state should look like. It's always about the process of getting there, and about who's responsible for what, or who's accountable for making sure those conversations happen. And to Gary's point earlier, that if you don't bring analytics in early, no one thinks that's a good idea. But it doesn't happen often, or at least it happens too infrequently. Is that because the analysts aren't raising their hands enough, or the analytics organization isn't raising their hands enough? Or is it because the rest of the organization is not thinking, I need to bring my analytics partner into this? It's probably a combination of both, but no one disagrees with what the end goal is. So it's one of those challenges that seems imminently solvable, but seems like a constant struggle. And I've been doing this for 20 years and I still haven't figured it out yet. So still working on it. I'll get there before I retire. I'm sure of that. I've led a few different analytics organizations in my career, and I've structured them all a bit differently. And with varying levels of success. And typically what happens is it works for certain teams that you're supporting, or certain clients that you're supporting, but it's not quite appropriate for other clients. But the key around structure for me is it doesn't need to be either functionally focused or focused on business units you're supported. I don't think you need to structure it in any kind of rigid way across all of your different opportunities, all your different clients or business partners, but it needs to be able to, in a frictionless way, work with those clients and work with those business units. So sometimes that means you structure it exactly the same as your business units. You have a marketing analytics group, and you have a sales analytics group, and you have a merchandising analytics group. It might not need to be that rigid, but it needs to be able to fit within that support structure in a frictionless way. And there's a variety of ways to do that. Being nimble and scalable, that's all about, from an analytics standpoint, there's an ebb and flow to the work of every function within the company. The challenge with analytics is we're supporting multiple different parts of the company, multiple different clients. So we are the victim of the ebb and flow that's going on everywhere, right? Which makes it very difficult to predict what the needs are going to be and where we need to scale up resources, where we need to scale down resources. So my guidance here, and my process here is always control the controllable, and making sure we're predicting needs where that is predictable, and just adjusting to everything else, right? But if you can control the controllable and figure out what is predictable, what is not, it's a little less overwhelming than trying to control everything because you're gonna have last minute things that come up, that just happens. Putting multiple eggs in each basket, what I mean by that is, and this is really about transition planning and dealing with resources that go on vacation or they leave the organization. I don't find that the challenge tends to be transitioning the functional requirements. It's transitioning the business knowledge. And as analysts, we tend to be very good at documenting code and what we did for a particular analysis. We're not as good at documenting the knowledge transfer process or what you need to know in order to do that well. So I look for ways to systemize that within the organization, because I don't think that comes naturally to us. It doesn't come naturally to me. I don't think it comes naturally to most of the teams that I've led. So we really need to systemize that. And then what I mean by unnatural osmosis, natural osmosis is going to happen anyway, right? You bring an analyst into a conversation, he or she is going to naturally get to know the business and the objectives and the particulars of that business and all that nuance, but they're only going to understand what they're only going to absorb what they're exposed to. So how can we find more ways to expose analysts to all parts of the business so that he or she, even if they don't need to know that today, they'll be ready for that type of work down the road. So both Gary and Yating, I may be pronouncing your name wrong. If so, I apologize. You brought up some key points here on what I call the two-way engagement process. So this is how does analytics engage with the rest of the organization? And this could be a conversation that I would have both with my team as well as with other teams, because the responsibility is absolutely two-way here. The one area that we talked earlier that you mentioned, Gary, is engaging analytics staff early and often. I think that's partly on us to poke our nose into situations that maybe we haven't been invited to, but it's also on our business partners to remember to bring in the analytics people early in the process. Clearly defining the roles, I see that as an accountability thing, that we want an open dialogue of accountability. We want our business partners to hold us accountable for what we promise to do. And we want to be able to hold the business partners accountable for what they promise to do. But in order to do that, we need to be clear about who's responsible for what. Thinking 2 steps ahead, again, that's just about planning and making sure that we're not just figuring out what we need to do this week as an organization, both analytics and elsewhere, but what do we think we're gonna need a month from now, and next quarter, next year. And then don't apologize for leaving your lane. That's, again, a two-way thing. I think for analysts, that's when you're involved in the discovery process or the strategy development process and you hear the conversation going in a way that is not supported by some of the work that we've done, raise your hand, be vocal and say, that idea might sound good on the surface, but we've done this analysis that suggests that might not be the best way to go. And for our business partners, I always encourage them to challenge the work that we do. It's very rare that there's one perfect type of analysis that's going to solve a specific problem. There are always options, right? So we need to expose those options and the trade-offs of those options to our business partners so that they can challenge them, right? Because sometimes the most precise model may take X number of weeks to create. Well, how important is precision versus getting something out the door? We need to balance those two competing needs. All right, analytic skill sets. Gary, you touched on consultants. So these 5 areas will probably describe 99% of analysts out there. You're either an analyst or a statistician or a BI developer or a data engineer or a consultant. You might be some combination of several of these, but this probably at least loosely describes what you do. But when I think about how to structure a team and what's truly needed, there's some other factors that come into that. So you need to understand how data savvy are our business partners. How best do they consume data? If you're with an agency, how data savvy are your internal partners in terms of the account teams and strategy teams? That's going to drive, in some ways, the mix of resources. So you may need more consultants if your clients are not necessarily data savvy, because they can't do that work. They need not only the analysis, but they need that full translation layer, to figure out what to do with this data. If you're with a very data savvy client or a very data savvy business partner, they can shoulder some of that load. So you may focus more on getting hands on keyboard and building out models and building out segmentation schemes and relying on your partners to do some of that translation. But it matters, right? It matters who those people are and what their skill sets are. And one thing that I like to think of this as, and I mentioned this earlier, is that emotional intelligence can be as or more important than technical competence, right? So we absolutely need the technical competence. That is just table stakes. We need to have that, but we need to have the right skill sets to translate that into the business. So I want to introduce the concept of the marketing scientist, and this is something that one of my current business partners, this is what he calls it, and so I've sort of stolen it from him because I love the term, and I love the application of it. And this is not necessarily a new invention, but it's a way to describe it that I think gets to some of the consultative mindset that Gary touched on earlier and that we were discussing throughout this is, and it could be a marketing scientist. If you're not supporting the marketing organization, it might be a sales scientist, could be a product, could be a merchandising scientist. But the goal of this individual or this function is to be the connective tissue between what the analytics team is doing, how that relates to the business strategy, and then how that manifests itself through implementation. So this doesn't necessarily need to be an individual person. It can be more of a mindset, right? So you may not have somebody who you call the marketing scientist, but you need resources within your team that can figure out how to bring those three pieces together. So yes, they understand the data science side, but they also understand the business and how marketers or sales leadership thinks about data and thinks about insight, and what language they need to be spoken in from a data standpoint in order to understand it. And you need to have at least some working knowledge of the implementation. And implementation, think of that as operational implementation. That I've seen a lot of segmentation schemes that are very pretty in the deck that's presented, but when it gets in front of the creative team and the marketing operations team, they look at it and say, "There's no way we can execute this with the tools that we have." That's a huge miss. So yes, we need to be analytically rigorous in what we do, but we also need to think about the downstream impacts of that and how's that going to manifest itself. And again, this individual or this skill set needs to be involved throughout the process. All right, so as we wrap up here, let's talk about some of the common pitfalls. This first one, and Joe, I've probably said this to you in the past, in prior lives we worked together, which annoys my team every time, but is that analytics has no value on its own, right? A model or a segmentation that's not tied to a strategy or to the operational realities of a business is never going to make its way into the business and is never going to have an impact. So when we think about the solutions we're developing, it's why that upfront discovery is so critical. And that if we don't understand exactly what we're trying to solve for and exactly what the operational challenges are, the operational constraints are within the organization, we may end up with something that looks great from an academic standpoint, but actually doesn't impact the business. Analysis doesn't care what you thought was true. Now, this is a message I give more externally to the analytics team than internally. And the whole idea is we have to avoid confirmation bias. So we all go into an analysis thinking, well, I believe this to be true. And we tend to embrace analysis that confirms it and discount analysis that refutes it. The idea behind analysis is to be as objective as possible. So we need to constantly encourage our business partners to look at what the analysis has found rather than how well it aligns with what they originally thought. This is another pet peeve of mine. Why is there always time to fix it, but there's never enough time to do it right in the first place? So I think we've all been in situations where we build an analysis and then it's due on Friday, so we deliver it on Friday, and then the next 2 weeks, we spend time redoing it, right? So Friday was this very firm deadline apparently, but we always managed to find time within the organization to either fix errors or more commonly realign the analysis to support the business needs. My view on this is let's use that extra time that we know exists in most cases and use that up front during the discovery process so that we don't make mistakes, but more importantly, the analysis fits the true objectives of the business. Unfocused curiosity can be an expensive distraction. This is another message that I give to my business partners often, in that when you're doing a midstream review of of what we found so far, it always raises a bunch of, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? And those are all good questions and probably worthwhile questions, but some work and conversation needs to happen to ensure that those questions are actually going to lead to an actionable outcome. Otherwise, we end up spinning our wheels and the analysis process never actually ends. And then from a modeling standpoint, models tend to be built for a specific use case. Sometimes they're applicable to other use cases. A lot of times they're not. This comes down to, again, the early stages of the conversation. What are we solving for? What are we not solving for? And the way that I try to frame it so people get motivated about it is, what are we solving for today? And what do we intend to solve for down the road? So it's more of a positive spin on it, that it's not a, yes, we're going to do this. No, we're not going to do this. It's, yes, we're going to do this today. Yes, we're going to do these other things, but that's going to be down the road. All right, so last slide. 3 takeaways for different parts of the organization, from my standpoint at least. So if you lead an analytics organization or you're part of one, here are the 3 things that I would just put in your head on a daily basis to make sure that you're supporting the business appropriately. First, it's, and we talked about this before, insist on having a seat at the table and make sure it's for the full meal, right? Measurement is the dessert. That's not the full meal. Discovery is the appetizer. We need to be involved with the appetizer, the side dishes, the main entree, and the dessert for us to do our job effectively. Providing options to a partner. Like I said earlier, there's rarely one way to do an analysis. There are trade-offs along the way, and we need to partner with our business partners to make sure that we're making the right decision as to how to approach it. And then again, aligning your structure to meet the needs of the business. For those outside of analytics, it's bringing people in earlier, bringing your analytic partner in earlier, and whatever you think is the right time, it probably is a week before that, right? So earlier is better. Figure out how to balance urgency, and curiosity with quality and actionability. Those are very different things, and they're not always aligned. And then this is for both of us, both analytics and elsewhere. Our partners should challenge the findings and the rationale of what we came up with. And we should welcome that, right? If we're not welcome to that, then you will have a natural conflict within what we're doing and what the organization wants. And ultimately, we're not trying to get everyone on the same page in terms of what's the right way, what's the wrong way. We're just trying to surface all the challenges, all the disagreements, so that ultimately, whatever we decide, we're all on the same page as to what it was decided, why it was decided, even if we don't all agree with it. And that's all I got. Any other thoughts, questions?
Great, thank you, Ken. This is great discussion. Good presentation.
Thanks, Gary. I appreciate your feedback throughout. I think that was really valuable to frame some of these things, probably in a better way than I framed them. So thank you very much for that.
So sometimes people ask me or I expect yes or no answer or right or wrong answer. I said, it depends.
Right.
There is no correct answer. There's a lot of gray area. And how do you understand the nuances?
That could be its own presentation. Is just that topic alone. Completely agree, because there's multiple ways to attack a problem. And it's typically not binary, and the answer is not always binary. There's a lot of, well, it depends, and how much time do you have, and sometimes it's how much budget do you have, and how important is precision versus speed. There's so many different trade-offs, and I think that gets lost sometimes, both within analytics and elsewhere, because of the urgency to get stuff done.
You are trying not to be evasive, but rather to be honest, and then provide maybe 2 or 3 options. Not only one, right? If you give them 10 options, it's too many.
Exactly. Yeah, you can definitely go too far in that direction.
Okay, wonderful. Well, then I want to thank you all for coming. I hope you got a lot out of this. It seemed like there was some good discussion. I'm really excited by that. Please feel free to follow up. Job descriptions, resumes, questions on the presentations, come directly to me, or seek out Lynn or Carol or any one of us at FocusKPI. Thank you all, and I hope you all have a great weekend. Thanks.
Thank you, Joseph. Bye. Bye.
Thank you.